social instability, economic instability is something that makes them very scared. They don't actually care about soldiers dying. What they're worried about is the oil price crashing, they have no money, and they care about society getting out of control. That is why they have bizarre paranoias.
Peter, you've written 3 books on propaganda, disinformation, and how authoritarian regimes shape reality itself. What is one thing that everybody should understand about how propaganda works today?
I think the big mistake is people think this is a conflict of information versus disinformation, when really we're talking about a competition between narratives and types of identity formation. Propaganda helps create types of people, your sense of who you are. But the most important thing, once you've grasped that, is that we have to compete in this space. Propaganda was initially a neutral word. It developed a bad reputation at the time of the First World War. In order to compete with noxious, toxic, evil propaganda, you're going to have to learn to use propaganda for good.
And when one thinks about propaganda now, obviously one thinks about Russia and Russian propaganda and how successful it's been. So in your view, what are the most successful tactics of Russian propaganda, domestically and internationally?
Firstly, Russia invests in all forms of information warfare, subversion, diversions, educational campaigns, cultural warfare. They see really the whole, panoply of things you can do, from bots through to ballets, as forms of statecraft, and ways to enhance the power of the Russian state, divide the enemy, demoralize opposition, and launch its evil wars. So firstly, they do this at scale. They care about it. A lot of the things they do are stupid, but the fact is they do it at scale. But at the end of the day, look, we're at the middle of in my opinion, a genocidal war against Ukraine, with the aim of obliterating Ukraine's independent identity. And at the end of the day, you have to keep your own population on board to do that. Part of that is done through some measures of fear, repressions, but all the research shows that there is stable support for Russia's intent inside of Russia. And so the most successful propaganda is that, to make Russians, the vast majority of Russians, supportive of the premise of the project, that Russia is an aggrieved and victimized power that deserves to dominate its neighbors, that deserves to rule over them, and that has a God-given right to obliterate Ukraine and Ukrainians. That is something that goes very, very deep, that has very deep roots, but which is completely at the heart of the current Russian propaganda project. And all the evidence we have shows that it is successful.
This made me think about this notion from your latest book, How to Win an Information War, which is about World War II, but it has parallels with what is happening today. It says that the Nazi propaganda was giving Germans a sense of identity in a confusing world. Would you say that this is what the Russian state is now doing to the Russian people?
Virtually all successful authoritarian propaganda does something like that. At a time when people don't know who they are, it says you are this superior being. There are other inferior ones that you can dominate. It cultivates sense of victim narratives, and it gives you clear roles to perform in life. So the Nazis told you that you were an Aryan. They gave you a uniform to wear, songs to sing, a community to be part of, activities to do. The Russian one is different. It's much more cynical, but it is also based around a victim narrative, a conspiratorial worldview that we are all under attack, that in this confusing world where there is no truth, where you can't trust anyone, we need a cynical leader like Putin to lead us, that we're superior because of our deep cynicism, that we understand this dark and valueless world. And that because we are victims, we have the right to crush and abuse others. So yes, in that sense, virtually all successful authoritarian propaganda solves the problem of people feeling confused people feeling that they're meaningless and people feeling that they have no power.
You also write in the book that one of the things that propaganda does is it takes away the burden of responsibility. And when you write about it, you specifically mention things like the massacre in Bucha. So does that mean that Russia gave a pretext to kill to people who already wanted to commit violence?
I think there's many. I think taking away responsibility and taboos is one of the most important and powerful aspects of authoritarian propaganda. Here we're talking about a very specific type of propaganda, which dehumanizes others and enables murder. It does that in many ways. Firstly, it normalizes sadism and aggression. It normalizes narcissism a lot of the time. We often wonder, why do people like leaders like Hitler, who are absurd, narcissistic, and can't control their emotions, or perform not controlling their emotions? Because it lets you be a narcissist, infantile person who can't control your emotions. It legitimizes the very worst in you. Now, with people who want to kill, with sadists, which is a frightening number of people, by the way, one of the great taboos in society is not to kill. You let that go, you release that, you create a permission structure for murder. It's frightening how many people are ready to take advantage of that. Listen to the scintillatingly powerful episodes in Перехваты, in this wonderful documentary about Russian soldiers talking to each other that was sort of captured by Ukrainian special services. You know, the recordings of them talking to their family and to each other over the phone, and how many of them talk about, you know, I'm really enjoying this. I'm really enjoying doing this. It's finally I can do it. And their parents going,
it's also their families saying,
and their family saying deep down, I've always wanted to do this. No, and it's not something that is uniquely Russian. I fear that it's a huge part of many societies. We see in war and many wars this happening. But for other people who might not want to go to war or go and kill, and might even feel some sort of discomfort at what their country is doing or what's being done in their name, which are many people, you know, as well, propaganda can take away the burden of responsibility. You know, it was not our fault. It was a setup. It was a provokacja, as they say about Bucha. Or one of the most popular slogans of the war that the Russians have used, we had no choice but to do this. We are such victims. We are so put upon by the enemies, the conspiratorial enemies of Russia, that we were forced to do this.
We just had to strike first.
We just had to go and murder all the innocent women and children. We were put up to this. So it is both a legitimization for those who want to take advantage of it, and is a getting rid of responsibility to others. Look, when we analyze Russian society, you know, there are so many different segmentations, but usually you find, you know, a really, really aggressive sort of, you know, almost paramilitary bloc who are thirsting for war, a very, very big authoritarian bloc who are very supportive of the war and fully buy into the propaganda, listen to TV, probably wouldn't fight themselves. And then a very big bloc, and numbers differ, 35, 40% of people who are essentially conformists. Yeah, they will just go along. They're often middle class, they're often the people who you would hope would stand up, but they don't. Even though economically the war doesn't benefit them, even though they would probably never have chosen the war if given the choice themselves, they conform and go along with it. And I think especially for those sorts of people, you know, who are very big and who are kind of a potential swing, you know, these are people who may have even like secretly, like, you know, probably were pro-perestroika in their youth, you know. I think for them especially, it's very important to kind of like push away any responsibility. And how often will we hear them say things like, I can't do anything about it. What do you want from me? You know, it enrages Ukrainians because they're like, we've had 2 revolutions against regimes we didn't like. And so many Russians will say, it's not in my power. It's got nothing to do with me. This is, you know, something far away. And a lot of Kremlin propaganda plays to this feeling, you know, push it far away. It's none of your business. You're not responsible. You don't need to do anything. The invitation to be passive. So that too is a very powerful offer to a large segment of the Russian population.
We are able to stay independent because we are supported by our readers, by our audience, by our viewers. That means that because we don't have a billionaire owner, nobody can call me, the chief editor, and tell me what to write about or who not to write about. to stay independent, we need to grow our community. We need more people like you supporting us and becoming our members. We are currently supported by more than 19,000 people from around the world who have confidence in our journalism. But we need to get to 20,000. And I'm asking you, if you can afford to support independent journalism in Ukraine, to follow the link in the description to this video. That will take you to the Kyiv Independent website, and you can become a member and join our community and help us stay independent and bring us closer to the goal of having 20,000 members supporting us. It is extremely important to us, and I want to also take this opportunity and thank you to everyone who is a supporter of the Kyiv Independent. Thank you. It is because of you that we are here in Ukraine and we are able to continue doing independent journalism here. Thank you. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is the concept of brainwashing. Because it's a pretty mainstream view in the West. It's something that I often encounter in my conversation, that this is Putin's war and the population was brainwashed into doing this. But I think brainwashing is, taking away a lot of responsibility. And you've said before that you're not a fan of the concept of saying brainwashed, even though you're writing about propaganda. So one would assume.
Well, quite the opposite. I really think, we can get into communications theory and how media works in general. It's always a two-way street. There's always the action of the propagandist and the propagandee. Now, very, very enforced messaging can definitely have an effect on people. We do know it can be persuasive. We do know people can change if they're submitted to a certain type of messaging and change the other way. But a lot of the time it's a two-way street. People are taking part in a communal enterprise. That was one of Sefton Delmer, the hero of my latest book. That's one of his great insights about Nazi Germany. People aren't brainwashed into becoming Nazis. They are active participants in a performance of white supremacy and sadism. They can snap out of it. This is his thing. He spends a lot of time in Germany. He was born in Germany. So the same thing in First World War. People snap out of it. They perform it. They are the beholden Nazi, praying to Hitler. And then 2 seconds later, they're someone completely different. So his conclusion is this is actually a piece of theater, that people are enjoying, that people get caught up in, that those who create it want people to be fully caught up in it, to totally commit to it. But at some level, people are making a choice and people are always free, even when they're in a frenzy. Even the person in the Nazi crowd, at some level, is playing being hypnotized, is not actually hypnotized. This whole concept of brainwashing is an odd one. It actually comes from a very, very uncertain pieces of character change that happened to American POWs in Asia. And you had this myth that the Asians had taken American POWs and brainwashed them to be communists. Actually, the stories were much, much more subtle and nuanced. So I'm very reluctant about brainwashing. But closer to home, my mother's a documentary maker, and she made a lot of documentaries about the Gulag when the archives were first opened, interviewed the last guards. I remember her interviewing a KGB guy, and she really had one question for him. Did you know the people that you were locking up were innocent? Did you know the people who were taken to the Gulag were innocent? And the whole thing, he's process, we had orders. And right at the end, he's everybody knew everything. My last book, this is not propaganda. That had much more about Soviet history, and a little bit more about Soviet propaganda. Certainly, I think if we look at the late Soviet period, everybody knew everything. Only a few dared to stand up and do something. Afterwards, people were we were so deceived by communist propaganda. It's no, you knew. You knew who was being arrested. You knew they were being arrested for nothing. You knew who was being punished in front of the party committee. You knew what was going on. So
the hero of your latest book, Sefton Delmer, was this genius, I think.
I think so. Not everyone agrees.
My impression was I was fascinated with his tactics when I was reading your book. He was a genius propagandist and journalist. And he was working during World War II targeting Germans in, he was based in Britain, but he grew up in Germany, so he knew Germany. And he was targeting Germans to try to break their trust in the Nazi party. Is that the right way to describe it? To make the war less effective.
Yeah.
So let's imagine Sefton-Delmer was employed by the Ukrainian state today to target the Russian population. Would it be even possible? What would he have to do?
So firstly, I think Ukrainians' services and the civil society who help them are probably doing, well, actually I know they're doing really cool stuff. I only get told a little bit about it as a kind of journalist and writer, but I think after the war we'll discover many information operations which were just as spectacular in their own way as the amazing drone attacks that happened the other day, dismantling 20-30% of the Russian army, so the Russian Air Force. So like with Delmer, I suspect the stories will be told after the war. However, where Ukraine always faces a limitation is scale. Yeah. So just to be clear, Delmer did incredibly inventive things. He had this incredibly, I think, deep insights into the nature of propaganda and how to subvert it. He used everything from pornography to sour people on the corruption of the Nazi party through to actually being given by the British government the biggest transmitter in the world at the time that could beam across the whole of Germany and the occupied Europe. So he had huge creative license, but also had huge technological support. I mean, there's a lot we can do with the tools we have now. But I think Delmer would be pushing to sort of have the equivalent of a VK or a Telegram at his disposal. He would want technology at his disposal. Look, in counter-propaganda, scale is very important. Yeah, these aren't tiny little targeted operations. We are trying to change the kind of opinions and behaviors of vast parts of the armed forces. Look, there's the obvious things that he would start with. Of course, he would immediately create a large multimedia project aimed at the soldiers, at their families, and start to work out what were the actual points of disagreement there. The obvious ones are about stopping conscription, but there's much more than that. There are huge difficulties inside the Russian army along ethnic lines, between criminals and ordinary servicemen, and many, many other dividing lines. There's huge paranoia among the families of service people about not being paid the money when they're killed. A lot of them, this is from sort of qualitative bits and pieces that I've heard from inside Russia, the families of Russian servicemen are very, very worried that the Russians leave dead bodies on the field so that they don't be identified, so they're not paid. So you would be thinking about all these vulnerabilities and how you would exploit them. I mean, Delmer's first radio station was a little bit like Prigozhin. It was basically a far-right voice, angry at the army for being inefficient. It was not a peacenik voice. Yeah, but as he told those angry things, as he vented that angry things, as he took this patriotic position, he would tell so many stories, it kind of became anti-patriotic. It would reveal so much that it would actually put people off. Delmer was a great believer of not being direct. You say, you're talking about one thing, but your intent is actually slightly different. Yeah. So the first focus would be the army and the soldiers. But then Delmer would be looking at the other cracks in society, and we could start thinking about that. A lot of people think that that's about kind of ethnic divides in Russia, the Free Bureaucrat movement. Maybe one day, I wouldn't put that top. The biggest issues we see are around economics, around inflation, around not trusting the ruble. I think he would be working together with economic warfare to put a lot of pressure on the Russian currency. Then there's a lot of rivalry between regions that are starting. In our research that we've done with different universities, we've actually found that the message that makes even very pro-Putin Russians skeptical about the war is when you talk about levels of crime, which is counterintuitive. It seems to have nothing to do with the war. But these are very authoritarian people. They don't like the idea of crime. They're into law, order, the strong hand. And when they see crime rising in society, which it is very sharply for many reasons, they get very, very upset. So first thing he'd work out, what is it that people really care about? That might not be the things we care about. I lead a war crimes project. I know that telling most Russians about Russian war crimes in Ukraine is not going to get very far. It's very important to do for there to be a record, for the truth to be there, but it's not going to change anyone. So the first thing is Delma would focus on the issues that really undermine the Kremlin. Secondly, he would use voices that these people care about, or believe. So whether that's soldiers, priests, whatever it is they care about, and whoever they may trust more than the Kremlin. Thirdly, and here's the most difficult piece, he would be very much thinking about his counter-propaganda in terms of the war itself. He didn't think he was doing journalism. He thought journalism was for democratic countries like Ukraine. He wanted to use information to help win a war. He called himself a propagandist. He had no problem with that. But he was very, very locked into this idea of how do you use information in the context of a war. Now, there it was a different type of war because, the British were attacking. But a lot of his efforts were like, how do you undermine the Russian, how do you undermine the German advance into the Soviet Union? How do you undermine the submarine sort of fleet that was in northern France? But today, that's not actually our main aim. Our main aim is to get Russia to stop its war. Maybe in the long term, it's regime change. But right now, the aim that Zelensky and all the other allies formulate is Russia, stop your war. Right now, it's to get to a ceasefire, on just conditions. So how do you stop Russia attacking now? That's what Delma would be thinking about. Not the sort of Russia in 20 years' time or decolonization. He'd want to know that. And what we know from this Russian regime is that they change their mind, they retreat, they pause, they change their calculations when they lose control, when they fear losing control. They're very, very paranoid about a repeat of 89, 91. Social instability, economic instability is something that makes them very scared. They don't actually care about soldiers dying. They don't actually care about military materials they'll get them from China. They're very calm about that. What they're worried about is the oil price crashing, they have no money, and they care about society getting out of control. That is why they have bizarre paranoias. So, for example, I don't know if you've noticed, whenever pensioners protest against Putin, he goes backwards, which is bizarre. He's not scared of pensioners seizing the Kremlin, but he can't control pensioners. And the sign that he can't control them is a sign of weakness. And that can act as a catalyst for other bits of society coming out of control. So Delma would be very focused on that. His ultimate audience would not be the Russian people, it would be the Kremlin. Look, you thought you could control Putin's rating? I just drove it down with the campaign. You thought you could control what people feel about salaries? I just did a campaign, which you saw, by the way. You saw me doing this, and I showed you don't have control. You're trying to recruit X amount of people to work in military factories in wherever. I've just done a campaign which stopped anybody, which sort of drove down recruitment to the factory by 50%. You are not in control. We can increase this. We can make this worse for you. And you pile those pressures on with economic pressure, with military pressure, with diplomatic pressure. And then you have the start of a formula to get the Russians to the negotiating table seriously. I think he would think about information as a form of deterrence. It would be to show the Kremlin that they're actually weak. That would be part of the mathematics that make them go, okay, maybe we need to make peace. The problem is, of course, that while Ukraine has been incredible at striking these psychological blows against the Kremlin, with the drones blowing up the Russian planes, was also a psychological operation.
And Crimean Bridge.
Crimean Bridge, permanently. Crimea is the big paranoia for the Kremlin. So these are military operations with a psychological effect. The problem is the Allies have never piled in. What you would want is what happened with the drones, followed up with the next day, but like the sanctions that show we really understand what hurts. We've done lots of sanctions. Most of them don't work. Some of them do. It would be sanctions here, military maneuvers here, secondary sanctions on Chinese banks. That's when that happened, when there were sanctions suddenly on Chinese banks to work with Russia, there was hysteria in the Russian financial sector. But the question is, you have to do it all at the same time. A couple of major defections, unearth aspiring, but all within a matter of like hours, days, weeks, piling on the pressure, And then you come to the negotiating table and say, we can do more of this.
And why do you think this hasn't happened?
Because we got stuck, Biden and Schultz got stuck in a very different theory of Russia, which was a fear of escalation. And their philosophy was signaling. We signal to Russia, you do this, we do this. It's like slow motion tennis. Like you do a backhand, we do a backhand.
Why doesn't this theory of de-escalation, why doesn't signaling work with Russia?
Because they're enjoying themselves. They think they're doing fine. And until they feel that their power is actually at risk, will they start changing their risk calculations? They're committed to this war. They like this war. They're trapped in their messianic, sadistic fantasies, of dominating Eurasia, of forming a new world order with China. This isn't like a little... I think the West thought this was like Georgia 2008. The Russians will do this, but then they'll want to get back to normal. I think that was the default position. Like, they'll calm down. That's not what's going on. They see themselves on a big mission. This is what they're going to do on their pension. This is their big project that they've been gearing up for. The only time they will stop is if they feel that their rule and their control is at risk.
Do you think that Russians have been enjoying themselves more in the past 4 to 5 months with the new U.S. administration, the new conversation, and it's like they're getting more attention and the whole push for ceasefire and so on?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been sort of doing any sort of pillow talk with Putin about whether he feels excited, but if...
Oh, no, you haven't? That's really disappointing.
No, but not recently. But there's a wonderful scene in the Sefton Delmer's autobiography when he goes and visits the Brown House, where Hitler had his base in the 20s. Yeah, when the Nazis are just rising. They're not even in power yet. They're still an opposition party. And he gets to the Brown House. And they're all looking over maps. And the maps are already, they're already cutting up Poland. They're not even in power yet. And they're already like dividing Poland and doing all these strange things. And he's sort of stunned by it. I remember visiting the Kremlin many years ago and talking, when you could still go there and interview people and talking to the present generation of leaders. They're obsessed with maps. And the maps they have are pretty big. They think globally. They never stop thinking like a global empire. And that was kind of weird, because if you'd go there in the 90s or early 2000s, they were no one. This security service elite, they would love to pull down a map for you and start going, we used to control this, and we used to control this, and this will be ours again. You're like, this is bizarre empire nostalgia. What are you talking about? Medvedev as president or something. Obviously, they want to crush Ukraine. But these guys think even more ambitiously than that. With Trump coming to power, some of them must feel that they have a unique opportunity to break the transatlantic alliance and then dominate Europe. Some of them, and we know that because the propagandists say this, and they're always telegraphing something in the Russian elite. One of the fantasies, and I hope it's a fantasy, I don't know, is to gang up with America to crush the European Union. We will dominate Europe together. Dugin talks about this openly. I don't take Dugin seriously, but that messaging is definitely there now. Lavrov kind of talks about it. So suddenly the map that's opened up to them is much bigger than Pokrovsk. The map that's opened up to them is kind of almost beyond their wildest fantasy. The end of NATO, the breakup of the transatlantic alliance, and essentially Russia being able to, if not control, but definitely dominate Europe. Yeah? That's now a possibility. I hope it doesn't come to pass, but in their heads, they are certainly thinking about this. They also might think they don't have a very long gap to do this in. While there's this chaos in the transatlantic relationship, while there's these tensions, while they also have Orban, Fico, the AfD, is this a moment they have to take advantage of now? Because, of course, they're also thinking, okay, it's Trump now. He's not reliable. He's very erratic. In 4 years' time, we have either a Republican or a Democrat in America that wants to actually hurt us, to kind of show as an antithesis to Trump. So they're clearly thinking we might not have a long gap. So the temptation for them right now to take that experimental step and show the world that NATO is over, that the transatlantic alliance is bust, oh, that temptation must be very big.
Can anybody be immune to propaganda? Can you train yourself to be sort of immune to propaganda? Because we all want to think we are, right?
I mean, it depends how you define propaganda. But if we mean to some sort of kind of like targeted campaign, let's take it at that simple level rather than other interpretations of the word. I think what gave Sefton Delmer his superpower was that he was open enough to admit that he was vulnerable to propaganda. One of the most moving passages in his autobiographies is when he describes being a child in Germany, sort of an English boy at a German school, getting caught up in this kind of authoritarian militaristic propaganda. So he's English, he's against the Germans. It's World War I, but he's there singing German patriotic songs and wanting to belong and wanting to be part of the crowd and wanting to play further. And he's so disarmingly open about that. That's what gives him the power to then do something about it. So I think the first step to saying that you can deal with propaganda is to say that you're vulnerable yourself. And we know the opposite. Certainly if you've spent a lot of time in Russia or bits of America, the people who are most vulnerable to propaganda are the cynics. Who's like, I can see through everything. You know, the New York Times propaganda, Kyiv Independent propaganda. We know everything. We've seen everything. And the truth is this batshit conspiracy theory. You know, those people who are like, oh, I'm immune, like the self-confident cynics. It's not just my experience. There's actually lots of social studies that show they're the most open and vulnerable to the most crass kinds of conspiracy theories.
So it's this lack of self-awareness, self-doubt that makes
self-doubt. A lot of propaganda is about feeling superior. You know, like we all feel lost and vulnerable and confused today because, well, for many reasons, but it's that kind of world we live in. We all search for some sort of certainty and explanation. So I think, you know, understanding that we're all vulnerable, understanding that if something is making us feel super self-confident and super superior and part of some secret knowledge that others don't have, that's probably, you know, either a pyramid scheme trying to sell you something or a conspiracy theory that is actually going to suck you in and suck you dry, or a political movement that's exploiting you. So yeah, I would watch for that. The moment you feel you know something about the world, that's a bad sign.
Your support is central to help us keeping the world informed about what's at stake in Ukraine. Consider becoming a member to help the Kyiv Independent provide locally produced journalism from Ukraine to the world.